Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome everybody. Um, I thought what I would do is make a serious attempt at encouraging the disappearance of Nobina Nando and have you four talk more amongst yourself. I have an initial provocation, if you will allow me, which ends in a question which you don't have to answer. Somewhere between the sheets of Somewhere between the sheets of cream wove parchment she lay, waiting for thought to take shape, ripe, full blown, secure, comfortable in the knowledge that before too long the waters would break. The first wail, strong and full throated. Later you held her in the crook of your arm, ginger, warm. Even later, you took upon yourself the loving task of nurturing her, watched her grow. Now, strong and independent, it is time for her to take her place in the world. It isn't easy, is it, to let go, to abandon your muse child, your poem? This is the frustrated theatre person in me, always trying to set a scene. Very briefly, I know that the prompt is preoccupied with the selling of poetry books. And we can, of course, discuss this and the age-old complaint that poetry does not sell, but if I may make a suggestion, would you all be game initially to set the scene by talking for a maximum of 5 minutes each to begin with about the need, the relevance, the immediate necessity of poetry in these dark times, resistance and the poetry that stems from opposing, even surviving the times, poetry like songs as a literature of the people, perhaps. Should begin here with Chris. Start. No, we just go this way.
Thank you for coming. My name is Chris Agee. I'm editor of Irish Pages, which is the biggest literary journal in Ireland, also a small independent press. We started 2 years. Here we go. Okay. My name is Chris Agee. I'm editor of Irish Pages, which is the largest literary journal in Ireland, and also a small independent press that started about 2 years ago called the Irish Pages Press. As you can see, I grew up in the United States, but I've lived most of my adult life in Ireland, 40 some odd years. So I'll try to answer. I will get to your issue about poetry in a dark time with just some preliminary observations. I think I can do it in about 6 minutes, 7 minutes, and they'll frame that question for myself. I always work a little bit to a script. Because it's more efficient. You can cover more ground if you remind yourself what you're going to say rather than stumbling in the midst of half thoughts. So I'll just go through it. I take the question of publishing poetry, whether it's important or not, is the same question as whether poetry is important. Obviously, if poetry is important, it needs to be published. There's two kind of bookends always in my mind about publishing poetry, because to date we've mostly published poetry and nonfiction. The first is the anthropological point, which is that poetry is nearly unique in its antiquity, its endurance, its continual relevance, its centrality at key emotional moments like song or dance. For instance, key emotional moments, births, weddings, deaths, loss, are generally occasions where people reach for poetry, however popular. So it must have some enduring appeal and enduring importance as a genre. It's also got a huge scope. It's unique relational embodiment of both the microcosm and the macrocosm, the particular and the universal. Because after all, it is one poet. And there is a kind of interplay between universal themes and particular details of the poet's life and experience. So those are the two kind of bookends or benchmarks that are often in my mind. Another one, somewhat related, each of these points sort of flows one from the other, is Theodore Adorno's famous comment that no poetry after Auschwitz. I've always felt that this was really directly aimed at survivors of Auschwitz rather than poets generally. And obviously that's not possible or true for everybody else, all other poets. It's an injunction for them against lyrical poetry, having experienced the camps. So it's sort of an injunction about the limits of poetry, and this is one of my benchmarks for those who experienced the Holocaust. But it's notable that Primo Levi broke this injunction in a famous book called The Survivor. He wrote of the memory of the camps interspersed with the life of the aftermath. And so poetry does continually break injunctions and advances in that way. This seems to me quite important, something quite important about, essential about poetry, that is tied up with advances in human consciousness. One thinks immediately of David's Psalms in the Old Testament, the Priam passage in the Iliad, Mandelstam's Stalin epigram, and of course more contemporary poets of all sorts. Robert Lowell's On the Union Dead about Vietnam comes to mind. Elizabeth Bishop's At the Fish Houses. These are great poems in which there seems to be some kind of advance in consciousness. The Priam passage is where Priam kneels before Achilles and asks for the body of Hector. Now that is against all the antique code. It seems to be. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. That Priam passage in the Iliad is about breaking the antique code, and it does seem to be an advance in consciousness when Priam begs for forgiveness and the body of his son, Hector, and Achilles accedes. Unquestionably, Priam at that moment is the greater human being than Achilles. And poetry records these moments or these advances continually over the centuries. That recording is not only apparent, not always apparent at the time, especially in the best poets, or those bypassed by the closed shop of fashion and taste. But these advances in consciousness are very evident in retrospect. And one of the great focuses of great literary scholarship, how did Eliot or Shakespeare or Elizabeth Bishop advance our understanding of the human condition, human consciousness? So for me, just to add very quickly, poetry is a kind of fusion language of sound, image, feeling, sensibility, intellect. Only in fulfilling all those and more does it really succeed. Most often as a sprint form, a fast form in terms of its length, rather than the prose marathon. This concise distillation make it the prime vehicle, among other things, for translation historically. Translation is obviously easier when you have, shorter forms. And therefore it's a prime vehicle of the translation of one culture to another. That's historically verified. And thus the prime vehicle of Goethe's and Mandelstam's idea of a world literature, a single literature, unbounded by national categories, although we use Indian poetry, Irish poetry, American poetry. Actually, Goethe and Mandelstam are essentially right. It's a world literature, and every poet knows that the lifeblood is from other people, other cultures, other poets. So, the cosmopolitan and the international, infusing the national lineages, are a prime feature of all good and great poetry. We only have to think of Yeats and, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Tagore.
Sure.
Mutual interaction across national boundaries. So, to address your point, I see poetry as the art of the single voice for the single ear. So it is by definition not a mass art, like the cinema, whatever the sales might be. And therefore we should not worry too much about mass sales. It's not a mass art. Therefore we shouldn't expect mass sales. Most of life and consciousness is memory, poetry is unsurpassed and unrivaled in telling what it was like to be an individual human at a particular time and place. Um, One particular time in one era. For after all, we are also single human beings, like the poets themselves, with a single voice and a single ear. It cannot be beaten, poetry cannot be beaten by any other art for the sense of the single life in the round. Last couple points. So I see it, addressing your point, in a dark age. I think poetry is by its definition, inherently anti-conformist, anti-authoritarian, anti-totalitarian, anti-populist, if it succeeds. The single voice, true to itself, speaks to the single ear, true to itself. As Brodsky once remarked, bad politics is a bad stylist. He said that in a Nobel Prize speech. Crude mass sensibility is totally toxic to poetry. But of course, final point, great political poetry is possible. But it's also very rare in the sense of succeeding in the long term, in the judgment of time itself. And I hope I'm addressing your point here. Explicitly, political poetry often fails in the long term. It requires a certain kind of poet whose understanding of politics is highly sophisticated and felt, a real imaginative category and experience, engaged at the deepest level, rather than engagé. Mostly these days, I feel, and past days too, political poetry is surface opinion, a fashionable, identitarian, self-indulgent, and right thinking, pretense rather than true witness. I'm very fond, and I'll end here with a quote by a Scottish poet, a very fine poet who writes very fine poems about all sorts of politics, including Scottish independence. He wrote, "No poet should feel obliged to engage with politics. All poets should be free to do so. A poet who wants to write politically hears two voices. One, the bardic voice, urges him or her to speak on behalf of a community, a tribe, a gender, a nation. The other insists only in truth to the individual self, an unstable truth which may elude communal, tribal, gender, or national definition. In Scotland, as in Ireland, and many other countries, bardic voice is a strong presence." So I'll end with that. I hope I've done it in 6
Thank
minutes.
you, Chris. Well, thank you.
I'm going to try this.
Yes, please do.
Is this better?
Yeah, much better. Oh, did everybody hear me?
Yes. So if we're talking about politics and poetry, not to make this about gender, but, you know. Thank you so much. So I was thinking a lot about that often quoted Auden line in his poem to Yeats after he died, "Poetry makes nothing happen." And of course the full line is, "Poetry makes nothing happen, it survives." And I think, poets are always writing poetry, and it's really interesting as a poet and a publisher of poetry. I edit a journal called Peril Magazine after the Yellow Peril, an Australian journal. And just seeing how at times of political crisis, climate crisis, every other crisis, the amount of poems we get in, the volume is much greater. And I think that's because it's the poet's work to think and to the poet's work to feel and to distill what they're thinking and what they're feeling into a poem. And that's, I think, how poems become viral, is when there are these times of crisis, because that's when people don't know how to think. It feels like it's a protest. You can read poems and feel like you're part of something. Does that answer or not answer your
This is
question?
terrific. Carry on.
That's all I have to say. I'll think of some more things.
No, that's wonderful.
Well, I'm reminded of 3 episodes. One, when I was a student still, in 1960, some British magazine carried out a conversation between major British publishers of poetry, Faber and Faber and Unwin and whoever. Now, Faber and Faber came out with the fact that it is not true that poetry doesn't sell. They say that we sell millions of copies. One. The other person said, we publish poetry not because it sells, but because you cannot think of human civilization without poetry. So publishing poetry is a kind of a civilizational duty. Now that is one episode. The second is after 11/9, what is the, huh? 9/11, the other way. After 9/11, there was a report in the New Yorker that in New York, many families will get together because there was a kind of, apart from dismay and sadness at what had happened, there was also some sense of insecurity and moral confusion. And they would read out to each other poetry. So this is the second thought that happened. The third is what's happening today in terms of the protests which are going on against the Citizenship Act. Most of these are led by women, and most of them are featuring poetry. Not only Faiz, but also Dushyant Kumar and Mukti Bodh and Rakbi Sahai, etc. So there is this scenario against which I, as a young poet, and there was not in Hindi publishing at that time, it was impossible to get a major publisher publish a young poet. So Bharati Gyanpith announced their big award, which is got to be India's Nobel, the Gyanpith Award. I wrote a letter to the director saying that it's all very fine, but this will be given to somebody who has achieved a lot. But what about those who are young and should be? So why don't you also announce a scheme that you will print 5 first books of young writers, at least 3 of them should be of poetry. Now he replied saying, well, this will be put to the trust, and the trust never agreed. But as for you, we will publish your book. So I took 1.5 years discarding around 150 stupid poems that at least I wrote during that period. I was rather young, 24 or something. And finally the book got published. Then I became a civil servant and I started thinking that I have got this book published by this sheer accident of my writing a letter, but there are any number of my contemporaries who will never get their books published. So I started a journal, which journal was very strange. It was called Pehchan, and each journal had 5 little books. And to cut the long story short, in about 4 years, and this is published by my own money, we published the first books of 15 young Hindi poets. Most of them, the ones who have died away is another matter, but most of them today are major presences in Hindi poetry. So now the question at that time was that publishers won't publish poetry but now I find among Hindi publishers, there are a lot of them publishing books of poetry by young poets. I mean, Rajkamal is not here, Vani is not here, and Gyanpith is not here. They have published in the last, I think, 3, 4, 5 years. So there is, obviously they are not doing it because they think it is a civilizational duty. I think they're doing it because poetry is selling. And there's a young publisher who came to me and published my complete poems, which runs into 3 insufferably large volumes. And he told me that he has published short stories and other kinds of books. The largest sale is of poetry books. So there might be a shift in terms, just as perhaps things have shifted from fiction to non-fiction, maybe there is a change that now more and more people find poetry interesting. Well, there had been a tradition, at least in the North India at one time, where we had public readings of poetry. We had Kavi Sammelans and we had Mushairas. Now, Mushairas is still thrive, and although many of them have deteriorated in terms of taste and content, but still a normal ambition of an Urdu young poet will be to succeed in a mushaira. But the normal ambition of a Hindi poet would not be to succeed in Kavi Sammelan, because the Kavi Sammelans have been taken over by very sentimental stuff or nationalistic poetry, etc., etc. So there is these public reading spaces seem to have receded in one level. At the other level, we organize from the Raza Foundation poetry festivals and things, and there is a large audience. It's not running into thousands like here, but it is still reasonably good, sensitive audience. So I think the general notion that poetry doesn't have readers or that doesn't have listeners is not true. If you take the all India scene in Bengali, in Malayalam, in Urdu, in Punjabi, I think at least these 4 languages, and Marathi perhaps, there is a large reading and listening public for poetry. That's what.
Thank you.
That's wonderful news. But it's actually true, I guess. I have just a couple of points to make, Naveen, and one of them has to do precisely with what's already a current in our discussion, the political role of poetry, or how poetry might intervene in our present urgencies. I have mixed feelings about this, and I suspect I might be a contrarian here. But I tend to think that there's a push-pull involved when we set out to think about the kind of role that a poet might usefully play in this situation. On the one hand, you want the poet or poetry to somehow represent the moment, the will of resistance. And on the other hand, you also expect poetry, or certainly we as poets would expect our work to be transgressive in its own terms. And I think there's, if not a paradox, there's certainly a tension there. And for me, this is really dramatized by Hum Dekhenge, this great poem by Faiz, which has become such a centerpiece in the discussion about the resistance of the last couple of months. And I had an interesting conversation with somebody in Delhi a few days ago, a student activist who was troubled because, as many of you here know, this poem has become a chant for people resisting and opposing the Citizenship Amendment Act. And on the other hand, the right wing, which is not remarkably original in the way it responds to things, decided that this poem is by Faiz Ahmad Faiz, it's anti-Hindu, whatever this might mean. And what I realized whilst talking to this student activist is that he didn't have a clear idea of how to defend this poem against this charge. Of course, as we discussed it, I said that there's no reason to fall into this simple and uninformed binary. Don't play by the rules of a game that's being imposed on you. At the same time, there is the danger that people on the left or in the resistance also treat this as some kind of slogan, as a bunch of slogans. And for me, that is an element in the crisis. It might not seem as important as opposing the right wing, but frankly, if you're going to embrace poetry just because it serves the purpose of a slogan, you're as destructive of it as anybody else is. And then you begin to wonder about the role of reading. I mean, if this chant can bring a large number of people together and unify them, give them a common purpose, as against that, what is the value of parsing that poem for its actual meaning, for the complexities of meaning that it actually involves? So this might be a completely minority kind of perspective on what to do with a poem, but I feel that we would fail in our role as readers if we didn't respect poems, even as they become important to us in our public life. We need to be aware of the private and the intimate life of poems. So I'm going to put that in play. It's a scale. I mean, on the one hand, you have the great machine of the political, and on the other hand, you have this sense of why are you holding on to this poem if you can't open it up, see that it is set simultaneously as a communist drama of resistance, but refers to the early history of Islam, that it could be in the voice of Bilal, a slave who becomes the Prophet's herald. Uh, it opens up towards the end, and I'm sorry I'm parsing this poem in some detail, but I think that's the attention we need to give poetry instead of discussing it in abstractions. I mean, towards the end, there is an embrace of a position that is actually Sufi, that's identified with Mansur al-Halaj when he says, An al-Haq, I am the truth. So far from falling into games of is this Islamic, is this anti-Hindu, it speaks for a far more oceanic sense of community and solidarity. So you need to make that journey through the poem to understand why it's important to your situation. So for me, this is an argument about close reading as a political duty. So that's one of the points that I thought I'd just put into play. The other one has to do with publishing. I mean, who are we? Even as the audience for poetry grows, my question would be, and this is an incredibly old-fashioned word, and you will all pour scorn on me for using it. I still am preoccupied with the question of a readerly sensibility. I'm absolutely happy for my books of poetry to sell and to find readers, but I remain troubled by this question of a dialogue between poets and their readers. Is it the poem, is it the book of poems that's going to carry the day, or is that an invitation to other kinds of dialogues, another form of pedagogy, a mutual pedagogy, if you will? How do we reach out to our readers beyond poems? Yeah, so these are the two questions I have. So, I mean, it's a wager on the unpredictable reader. And how does one form a dialogue that continues beyond the book as a commodity?
May I invite Mindy to, would you like to comment on any of this?
Sorry, small. I guess Ranjit, I was wondering, I think that's really interesting. What is the impulse, do you think, behind wanting to continue your dialogue with the reader beyond the book as commodity? That's all.
What is my impulse?
Yeah, behind wanting to, yeah. Or why should the book not be commodity if you're the poet, you've written your poem and it's out there? Why do you feel, sorry, it's the end of the question now, why do you feel that it's your responsibility to continue that relationship with the reader who you don't know?
Partly my curiosity about who's reading me. Partly just my curiosity about my deep gratitude to people who buy my books, but also my sense of curiosity about who's reading them and why. A sense of gratification that there is someone who feels touched and moved, compelled, whatever it is, by these poems. So I'd like to know more about why that is. I guess it's similar to why artists uh, hang around at their own exhibitions. I think they're intrigued by how people respond to their paintings or videos or installations. It's also a sense of, again, I do not in any way want to disrespect the book, but there is a way in which it becomes an object in circulation. And I'm interested in what kinds of conversations. If I might not want to be part of those conversations, but I would love to eavesdrop.
I mean, I guess poets are quite vain. There's this video of us here, and I've been watching my reflection in the mirror behind you all. So I don't have a book, but this is my version of that gratification.
Just before I bring Chris in and then Ashok on both of these things, it just struck me that, I mean, when you have artists hanging around their paintings, opening or visiting it anonymously as the show grows, beyond the Kamisamelans or the equivalent of readings, and now this business of performing your poetry in a certain kind of way, how does one reach out uh, to a reader? Because it's such a the book reaches presumably a larger number of, and there's no feedback mechanism and so on and so forth. This is just a comment of it, but I'd like you to take this further, respond to them.
You see, a book is a mysterious object in one sense, especially a book of poetry. Other kinds of books perhaps can have a reasonable expectation of doing this or that. A book of poetry is completely mysterious. You cannot predict what is going to happen. Uh, for instance, Dushyant Kumar, who's now a very popular Hindi poet, we did not take him seriously when he was writing those poems, because those were the days when he wrote against emergency and all. But he was not mentioned on the same level as Shamsher or Muktibodh or, I mean, some of these other luminaries. But over time, because there are I entirely agree with the anxiety that he expressed, that uh, poetry may not be sufficiently read, but used. But then this can be true about any damn thing. I mean, you can possibly be prepared we all prepared that we will be misinterpreted. Uh, in the current climate in this country, almost everything is subject to misinterpretation, and we have a climate of misinterpretation to justify all kinds of atrocities, this, that, and the other. Now, misinterpretation, I dare suggest, is also an interpretation. Misuse of poetry is also a use of poetry in some sense. And sometimes you're surprised that this is being used in this manner. So it's not always, shall you say, it's not always disappointing that a poem is being used in this manner. I'm quite sure those who are using Fair's poem are not aware of these subtleties and things of that kind. What they are pitching on is that this poem was sung by Iqbal Bano when there was a tyrannical system in Pakistan, and against she was banned from singing, and she dared and sang. And therefore, Hum Dekhenge has become a kind of a slogan.
Yeah.
Now, all the things that are becoming slogans have some kind of a rhythmic pattern. Hum dekhenge, hum kagaz nahi dikhayenge, etc. These are all sort of some kind of poetic utterances which are being made into, and I think there might be use of these phrases in a particular situation like ours. Because after all, poetry does both. It gives you the necessary loneliness to ponder over your dilemmas or anxieties, and it also creates a sense of community. And sometimes these two functions of giving you, shall we, gifting you loneliness, but also connecting you in a community way. And sometimes these roles, one of them may be underplayed, the other one may be overplayed, depending on the circumstances. And the circumstances being what they are at the moment, I think this kind of a overplaying of the community solidarity-making role of poetry, I think is legitimate.
It's itself an act of resistance,
Yeah.
which is what the slogan has become.
And if you look at the history, even in India or elsewhere, the poems which are used are not necessarily great poems. You know, they not even be good poems. But we have any number of examples that. So there is this problem.
But they become relevant points.
Yeah,
for
yeah,
that matter.
yeah. I mean, so they express a movement or a sentiment in a manner which becomes memorable. But if you look at, I mean, this is Faz's poem, got this, but this is not a great poem of Faz if you have looked at his entire repertoire. Similarly, many other. So, I mean, you know, it does not necessarily mean that great poems cannot be used. I mean, what was Easter? W.B. Yeats's poem, A Terrible Beauty is Born. Yeah. Yeah. Not the second coming, Easter. Yeah. Now, I don't know whether that poem became a great hit with the people at that time, but it certainly is a great poem. And so sometimes the terrible beauty is born. The fact that it is terrible does not cut into the fact that it is also beauty.
I'll just answer quickly two small points, and the first is that Easter 1916, far too sophisticated to recite at a rally, but it is a touchstone in Ireland for the uprising, you know, for the gallantry and also the hardened heart of violence. It is absolutely well known throughout Ireland, but it could not be recited, which is probably a good situation to be in. Mindy's point about poets, yes, vanity. We were once sitting around in a festival trying to work out the collective noun for poetry, for poets. You know, pride of poets, like pride of lions. You know, a pod of poets. I have to say that I was rather pleased with the collective noun I came up with, which was an ego of poets. But just to come, most of you have heard of Seamus Heaney. So I think these 3 points about Seamus Heaney, short poems, will address various things that were said. The first thing, in Ireland, of course, we have partition like India, and all the tensions and all, as James Connolly, as Scott's labor leader said, the whole carnival of reaction that has been created by partition is very much present, of course, in the north, where our journal is based, although the editors are, and the journal itself is all Ireland. The main thing to say about Irish writing and Irish poetry of the last 40 years in relation to the extreme and intense microcosm of the violence that occurred there is that Irish poets warn that language matters. Language matters. The words you use matter. Derek Mahan and Seamus Heaney continually warn about the language that is being used. And this is a lesson that has been obviously forgotten by Trump, probably forgotten by Modi and Orban and everybody. They're just using language, you know, loosely. And loose language, to paraphrase the British military poster, loose language costs lives. And it will cost lives. And that is the lesson of Irish poetry in relation to the very vicious violence that occurred, sectarian violence, as clearly has happened in India and it can happen further. So Heaney is a great exemplar of fine language dealing with these issues of violence, which he deals with continually in his poetry. So that's the first thing. A specific poem by Heaney. Jacob, you can tell me the name of the poem, the train poem with Danny Morrison. What was the name of that poem? Anyway, there's a poem where Heaney meets Danny Morrison on a train north to south, small country. It's about the size of West Virginia or a smaller state of India. It's only 5 million people in Ireland. Someone said to me, Ireland is a literary superpower, despite its small size. And this poem is a great reflection on this question. A activist, well known in Ireland, named Daddy Morrison, spokesman for the Republicans, he came up with the phrase, a ballot box in one hand, an Armalite in the other. said, "What have you actually done to us, for us, Seamus, our cause?" And he said, "Whatever I do, I'll do for myself," which is a great answer. Third point, we talk about readerships, and I like your point a lot. I once heard him say, yes, readerships. Well, I think of it this way, that, and he had a huge readership of a variety of types. Some people, claimed to have read a lot of it and really hadn't, but, so many people knew something of his work. He said there's three different kinds of readerships. One, you have a public, right? And that's everybody who knows something about your work or a lot about your work. Then that might be 10,000 people, it might be 50,000. Then you have a readership, people who actually read the work. That's a readership. Maybe that's 100 people. I mean, he's being very modest. I think it was a lot more than 100, but probably in Heaney, reality is probably only a few thousand or a few 10,000 really was a readership. And then he said, you have the people who really read it. That's called a culture. And that's a good way of thinking of poetry. So as a publisher, I want to avoid the hearsay heresy, which is what, just word of mouth about who's good, who's not. Read the work and publish what Eliot and other people have called work of permanent value. And in order to create, one, a public, maybe you get that. Hopefully you get a readership, and maybe somewhere you get a culture. And of course, like all cultures, like all small cultures, like opera or obscure forms of music, it has often a residual but powerful impact. Raymond Williams, a great theorist of culture, said there's three kinds of culture: a dominant, emergent, and residual. And he remarked, residual often can be the most powerful in the long term. So we see dominant social media. Poetry perhaps opposes that emergent or dominant culture in many ways, and it may, in the long term, prove more powerful than people think. So, quoting Heaney, language matters, and poetry is par excellence the art of careful language. Hope that answered.
I was just thinking between both of you on the misuse as use, and also Trump. How before he comes on to speak, he plays "You Can't Always Get What You Want" by the Stones. That's not what the song's about. And Jess, which president played "Born in the USA" before he? Reagan. That's not what the song is about. So I think words really can be weaponized, especially when they're taken out of context. And I think the quotable nature of poems that maybe aren't great poems, but they sound very nice if you use a line or two, you can really turn a negative thing into something very positive, and a positive thing into something very negative. And the way that kind of people will latch onto something and use it can really just shift the meaning, and then everyone thinks that something is what it isn't. And I think, I don't know, that's just what I think, that it can be very dangerous.
I'm reminded of what the major Polish poets post Second World War did in Poland. I mentioned two, Czesław Miłosz and W. Herbert. Now, it was not possible for them, living in that regime, to be writing directly political poetry. So what I have been saying, that they resorted to a poetics of satyagraha, which is speak the truth in the language which is poetic language, but by irony and indirection. So at one point, W. Herbert said, oh, it was not a matter of courage, it was a matter of taste. And thereby created an entirely new way of looking at it. They were doing it as a matter of taste, because the civilized poet and the civilizing poetry would be doing it as a matter of taste, not create a kind of an alternative which is simple binaries, this is bad, that is good. So they were doing something more subtle. And I think there are times when you could be doing that in a subtler, more indirect way, in a situation where poetry can do it much better than perhaps other forms. So I don't know whether contemporaneous fiction in Polish language was doing the same thing, but I certainly know that these poets, Szymborska and Tadeusz Rozewicz also joining in, they all together uh, brought a new kind of poetry, which is the poetry of resistance without dramatizing itself in that manner.
Sort of subversion of sorts. We're kind of running out of time, whatever that means, but I'd like Ranjit to come in for the last word with that before we open it for Q&A, because I'm getting little haikus sent to me from that. So please.
No, not much to add really, except that it's precisely, Mindy, when you asked earlier why a poet might want to have a further dialogue with her or his readers, uh, it's precisely for many of the reasons that have now come into play. You're hoping that some of the readers will will join the readership and they might move on to be part of the culture. Uh, and also, Ashokji, uh, taste is the term that, who is it, Bignav Herbert or Milosh? One of them used. Yeah. Uh, what is that? I mean, how do you affirm that taste, or what I call sensibility? What is the common ground between the unpredictable reader and your work and your transgressions? I mean, where does that get discussed? Might that be a reading circle? Might that be the world of the journals? That's what interests me. I mean, the actual institutions or platforms where these conversations take place. Because otherwise, there's a whole lot that goes on in poetry that might just be opaque. Some might argue that poetry generally is opaque, but that's not what I'm saying here. Uh, Allegory, allusiveness, the kinds of Sandhya Bhasha, so to speak, that a poet might invoke. How do you know that's going across? So you need that meta, it sounds absurd, but there's a kind of meta poetic discourse that goes on around your work as a poet, and I think that's vital. I don't think that's vanity. I think that's actually a wager on solidarity.
Maybe a quick response before we.
No, I agree. I think I just wondered because I am so shy that when people say anything about work that I've read, I just kind of clam up. So it's very interesting to hear that you like to have that kind of dialogue, because for me it's once I've put it in the poem and I'm done with the poem, I don't want anyone to tell me what they thought because I don't want to feel things. I felt everything and I put it in the poem and that's it.
Thank you. Chris, you have a quick.
Just two quick points. Of course, once the poem leaves you, it's not under your control anymore. It's interpreted, because the real poem happens in the head of the reader. This is why Beckett, in a different field, is so great, because he says certain things and leaves the rest for the imagination. For instance, the great line about apocalyptic thinking, for to end again, yet again. That sort of simplifies the whole apocalyptic idea. For to end yet again, and it leaves the rest to you. And the idea that you use, Ashoki, of altogether you get a style or an approach. That was very important in Polish poetry. It was very important in Irish poetry and many other poetries, that altogether it creates a style pattern, which is a kind of inner resistance, even if you're not against the regime. You begin to think in terms that are completely different from the dominant culture. That is very important when it finally breaks out. When the revolutionary moment or upheaval breaks out, there's a lot of people who have absorbed a lot of different influences, poetic, musical, artistic, that don't go along with the dominant ideology.
Thank you so much. Anybody have any questions or poems?
Hi, so my question is to Mr. Vajpeyi. You spoke about how poetry is used in slogans and protests, and you said poetry is used in slogans during protests and about the NRC and everything. And you said that even if they're not very great poems, they're still used, and that takes away the meaning of the true meaning of the poem. My question is, don't you think that during protests become more relevant and kind of resonate with what people are feeling at that time?
Yeah, sure. I will not argue against their using it. And I'm not saying that thereby these poems obtain a meaning and a resonance which is perhaps unusual, but it is a interesting community use of poetry, which is one of the possibilities anyway. I mean, a lot of Tulsi Das, for instance, in North India, is used for all kinds of purposes, including very ennobling purposes, uplifting purposes, but also for very unholy and ignoble purposes. So, I mean, this is, you cannot stop it in this any sense. It is possible, of course. Yeah.
Anybody else?
No, thank you.
Yes.
Sorry,
Oh, no.
I had a friend who used to say, "Prashn पूछो, prashn का उत्तर न पूछो." So no, please go.
No, the gentleman from Ireland, you mentioned that the partition, the books about are there a lot of poetry on the partition? I was just curious if there's been any exchange that might resonate with Indian or Pakistani readers about those sentiments.
There have been, of course, anthologies and, you know, all sorts of things that perhaps address directly partition. But partition is such a huge feature of Irish life, particularly it dominates everything in one quarter of the island, that it would be impossible not to have this recorded. I mean, in Belfast and throughout the north of Ireland, it is a totally dominating fact. So, you know, there was an anthology called Poetry of the Troubles and so forth, and I would imagine that there would be a lot of resonances about the general dynamics of sectarianism. But I mean, the partition of Ireland is a huge...
Tell me there are no more questions because I have something I want to hear. Is that okay? Good, wonderful. आपसे पूछना था, I really, because yesterday's session, we had a wonderful session, and there was a point when somebody wanted to know or mentioned or commented that haiku is a form that seems incomplete, and that there's something more. And I was kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum. And you had a very interesting take on the Sanskrit and then the Doha. Will you please share that with us?
No, I mean, you know, the short form. I mean, haiku has become internationally known, and now haikus are written in all kinds of languages. Even in Hindi, they started being written in 60s. One of the first poets who used the haiku form was Agee, who, after his return from Japan, used it. But this is not the only short form that we have. In our own tradition, there have been at least two short forms. One is, in fact, three now. I did not mention. One is the Subhashit in Sanskrit, which used to be 2 lines, usually meant to instruct, both delight and instruct. So give you some kind of a, that is one, Subhashit. The second was Doha, which was 2 lines. Again, it's used by Tulsidas and many others. And Doha, again, 2 lines. And you have to complete whatever you want to say in 2 lines. And the third is a sher in Urdu. Now, the ghazal may consist of 8 shairs, but each one of them is complete. And it has an existence outside the ghazal, which is not necessarily, I mean, मुद्दत हुई है यार को मेहमा किए हुए जो शे क़दा से बज़ में चिरागा किए हुए. Now, this is complete. You don't have to go to the next share if you don't want. And most of the times in the Urdu speaking or Urdu knowing communities, the whole ghazal is hardly ever mentioned or recited. What is recited is these 2. हम कहाँ के दाना थे किस हुनर में यकता थे बेसबब हुआ गालिब दुश्मन आसमां अपना. That's it. So there has been that kind of a brief moment. In each one of them, you are telling something about reality, about nature, about life, about living, whatever, in a very concentrated form. So there have been tradition, I'm sure in other languages there must be similar tradition all over the world. But haiku somehow became more international than others.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you.